So I want to start working towards the presentation of this robot, and I did a couple of things since the last time I recorded. The last time you saw this, uh, I, I made a couple of optional workflow videos, and I just want to remind you that there's no audio in those videos. That was just me hitting record. I wasn't going to talk through every step. It was just going through the process of kind of updating the robot, building some of the details. And I did actually have a couple of legs and a couple of arms in the robot, and I've since deleted them. And there were a few things that I did not record, and I just want to kind of talk you through those really quickly. The first thing is I did a little bit of cleanup inside my object manager. Now I just really reorganized some of the hierarchies and built parent-child relationships to make the leg function properly, the arm function properly. And if you get hung up on this, the best thing to do is just make sure that things are named properly. And you can always jump into a standalone document if you're hung up on how the hierarchy should work. You can simply do this based on a simple set of cubes and structure those like an arm or a leg. And I'll just make a duplicate of this, and I'll call one of these upper, and I'll call the other one lower. And it's really helpful sometimes just to work out some little experiments. I'm going to select this upper leg or upper arm, whatever you want to refer to it as, and just temporarily I'm going to make it editable, and I'm going to edit the axes, and I'm going to move that up. And again, that's just simply to get this thing to rotate around a pivot point. And now I won't do that for the second cube, although it should be, it should be implied. And I want to take the lower and drop it in the upper. And so right now I can just test to see that that relationship works. I'll grab the lower and I'll rotate that. And even though I didn't fix the registration of the pivot point, I can still see that that relationship works the way that I intended it. So if you get hung up and you get confused, this is a critical piece to this project, figuring out the hierarchy. And this way you can pose this thing like a character when it's done. You can pose it without the character completely falling apart. And so I can take my upper arm and I can rotate that into a position, and the lower arm goes with it. And if I reveal the hierarchy here, I can find the lower arm and I can rotate that as well. So I can start to pose this character. And if I don't like that pose, I can just go back and find the upper arm or the lower arm, and I can zero out the rotation values of that. And actually I wanted that originally was kind of more in this position. Okay, and I can go back into the lower arm, and I can zero out those values, or at least get them back to the position that they were originally in. So I'll go through and I'll undo this until I get that back to the neutral position that I was in. And so that's the basic concept here. So I did a little bit of cleanup in the object manager, and I also built a couple of really simple textures. I have this, and I'll just pop these open so you can take a look at these. The first texture that I opened up is simply this texture called metal joints. And I created that by just using kind of a charcoal gray color. I turned on the reflection channel, I added a little bit of reflection, and that was it. So this is a really simple, really straightforward texture. It has a color and a little bit of reflection. I then made another texture, and I'll just call this robot body. And this is the main color of my robot. And I added a color channel, and this is just a lighter kind of bluish gray. And I added a little bit of reflection here, a little less than the darker metal parts, just to add a little bit of contrast. And the only thing that I did in addition is I modified the diffuse channel just a little bit. And what I chose to do with the diffuse channel, and if I bump up the mix strength to this, you'll see this really dramatically. It basically kind of dirties up or adds a texture to the way that color and light is reflecting off this channel. And what I did is I just simply, in the texture channel, I chose to add some noise. Okay, and I've added a kind of noise, and then I reduced that mix strength ever so slightly, so there's a real subtle, just a real subtle kind of textures, and it's not obvious at all. It's a really, really subtle effect, but it kind of adds a little bit of distortion to the surface, and it causes for just a slight bit more contrast than some of the than this metal texture. Okay, so that was the basic concept here. Finally, the third texture that I made is just a simple texture that causes this eyeball to glow. And this was a really simple texture as well. I took a color channel. I chose kind of a deep red, a deep dark red. I turned reflectivity on and made it much more reflective than anything else. So I adjusted the reflectivity to 20%. And then I turned on the glow channel and I reduced the outer strength from 500 to 200. And so now when I give this a render, this is what my robot is currently looking like. And you can see that there's a real nice subtle little glow effect here. You might not be able to see it in the screencast, but if you experiment with this, there's a little bit of a halo that's popping up around my eyeball. Now, I'm going to make that a little bit more pronounced here in just a minute through some of my lighting and rendering strategies. And so what I really want to talk about is I really want to focus on bringing this robot to conclusion and focusing on the presentation, okay? And in a previous video, I set up, I talked about replicating the arms and rotating those into position. And the reason that I've deleted those, so now I only have one arm and one leg, was for two reasons. First, I wanted to kind of tweak some of the details of the model. So, you know, I added a hand here or a little claw, and I wanted to replicate that. And I also applied textures. And so instead of applying textures to two different sets of objects, I thought I'd delete the untextured versions. I would modify the model just a little bit to tweak it, apply my textures, and then do a quick duplicate. So I'm not gonna, I'm just gonna do this really quickly. I'll take the left upper leg and I'll do a quick copy and paste. And now I have this left upper leg, and I'll just call this right. This is the same process that I went through. The only difference now is that this is has a texture applied to it. And so I'll do the same thing with the upper arm. I'm gonna copy and paste. I'll move that along the X value, and in this case I have to go into rotation and just rotate that arm 180 degrees. Now something, I'm missing the shoulder over here. There's a few little odds and ends, a few parts, but I can live with this for now, for the presentation. So I'm gonna arrange these so that the arms and the legs are together. So I have the upper arm, the two upper arms are sitting together, and the right upper leg and left upper leg are sitting together as well. So that's about all the information that I need in terms of my model. Now I'll probably go back and refine this some more and add some variations. Maybe I'll have a different hand on this end. But for the most part, I feel like my robot is ready, and it's ready to start thinking about the presentation. Okay, and I made one consideration for the presentation already, and that's I've introduced a cylinder, and I've flattened that out to where it has a really, really low height. And I'll just key that into 5 meters, and I set a radius of 3,000 meters. And that just kind of gives me a nice round platform to set my robot on, and it gives me a surface to catch shadows when I render. And so the next thing that I want to do is I want to start to consider my lighting. And we've talked about point lights, and we've talked about 3-point lighting. I want to introduce another kind of light, and that is a infinite light. And an infinite light is kind of interesting in that when you introduce it, it doesn't really care what its position is. It really is just concerned with what its direction is. The concept for this light is that it's, you can think of it kind of like the sunlight. It's effectively infinitely far away. So it's coming from somewhere else other than the scene, but it has a direction to it. So you can think of it kind of coming from outer space. And what we can do is we can adjust the direction of the light. And so I'm going to point it down as if this were more of a sun or a moon light, and I'll just tip it just a little bit. So I'm starting to cast light from kind of the back left side of this robot. And the whole concept of a directional light or an infinite light is that the scene is completely evenly lit. Okay, so no matter how far away we get from the center of the light position, the objects are still going to be illuminated. So if I just take this object and I move it way back in space, okay, if this object were being illuminated by a point light that's floating over here, when I render this object, that would fall out of its illumination, okay, because there's a drop-off to the light. There's not a drop-off to this directional light. So the directional light is a really nice kind of fill light, okay? It's a little too intense right now, and though I could turn on shadows, my basic lighting strategy is that I just want this light to act as just a real subtle fill light. It may have some color So maybe I'll apply kind of like just a little bit of a blue to it, maybe to emulate some kind of a night light, a light that you get from standing outside at night. And I could turn shadows on for this light, but I'm actually going to introduce another primary light source and use that for shadows. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this intensity and bump it way down. Maybe we'll do like 20. And so if I render this, you can see this is a really subtly lit scene. I can barely even see what my robot, my model here. So the next step is I'm going to introduce an additional light source. And we've talked about this light object, or also referred to as a point light, and we've talked about spotlights. One of the most sophisticated kind of lights in Cinema 4D is this area light. And I'm going to introduce an area light. And I'll move this, I'll back this up. I'll lift it up in space. And I'm going to rotate it and position it. And by default, it kind of comes out as this rectangular shape. And this area light can cast really sophisticated shadows when they're turned on, and it's a really nice quality light. If I give this a render, the lighting of this is pretty sophisticated. And if you compare an area light to a standard point light or an omnidirectional light, you'll start to see some of the effects if you do some rendering tests, particularly when you start dealing with shadows and some rendering effects. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this area light that I introduced into the scene. I'm going to go to the shadow type, and I'm going to select either shadow map soft, ray traced hard, or area shadows. And the thing that you need to know about lights and shadows, particularly with an area light is a really complex illumination model, and we'll pay the price for it with rendering time. It's much more sophisticated, therefore our computer has to do many more calculations to consider the light. Same thing with these shadows. You can think of this as a continuum. If we set this to no shadows, it's really simple. It's a really simple solution to calculate. Shadow map soft look pretty good. It gives you a nice soft general shadow, and it's the simplest kind of shadow to calculate. A ray traced shadow is a slightly better quality shadow. It gives you kind of a hard edge, and you have a lot more control over this kind of shadow in terms of the shadow properties. And finally, there's an area shadow, and this is the most sophisticated kind of shadow. And you can see that the minute I start to render this, it takes a lot longer to render. But there's a very different kind of shadow that's being generated here. So, and this is the most accurate to a real-world lighting situation. And I actually don't like the look of the shadow here, and part of that's because the light's a little too close. It also has to do with the kind of shadows being generated. And so I'm going to make some decisions about the lighting scenario as I move forward. But right now, this actually looks okay because I'm really paying attention to the illumination on the robot. Okay, let me kick this back down to soft shadows and render that again. You can see how quickly that renders. And so for the sake of the demonstration, I'm actually going to keep it on soft shadows because I want to render very quickly. And I also want to experiment with a couple of different kinds of variation here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause this video, and we'll catch up and talk a little bit more about lighting and rendering in the next presentation, and then we'll wind down the robot project with some final thoughts. So we'll catch up in the next presentation.